Picture this, one of the most recognizable CEOs in the world driving around Silicon Valley in a $130,000 silver Mercedes-Benz SL55 AMG with absolutely no license plates. For over 2 decades, Steve Jobs pulled off what seemed impossible, legally driving without plates while everyone else followed the rules. But here's the kicker. He wasn't breaking the law, he was exploiting it. Today, we're deep diving into one of the most ingenious legal loopholes in automotive history, a loophole so closely associated with Apple's co-founder that California lawmakers literally called it the Steve Jobs loophole. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this brilliant hack cost Jobs a fortune, changed California law forever, and reveals something fascinating about the mind of a tech genius: the mystery. For years, people in Silicon Valley would spot the same strange sight: Steve Jobs' gleaming silver Mercedes parked at Apple headquarters, always in the same handicapped spot and always without license plate. Tech blogs went wild with theories. Some thought he was just paying the fines. Others speculated he had some special government permit. Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak even claimed, quote, "You can get a permit for that." Steve was always trying to be anonymous and hidden. But the truth was far more elaborate than anyone imagined. The mystery deepened because this wasn't a recent quirk. According to legendary Apple programmer Andy Hertzfeld, Jobs had been doing this since the early 1980s. First with his black Porsche 911s, which he would replace with identical black Porsche 911s every 6 months, and then in the 2000s, he switched to that infamous silver Mercedes SL55 AMG, following the exact same pattern. Think about that for a second. We're talking about 3 decades of the same bizarre behavior. This wasn't some random rich guy eccentricity. This was a calculated system. The revelation. The truth finally came out in 2011, just after Jobs' death, when John Callis broke his silence. Now, Callis isn't just any Apple employee. He's a legendary cryptography expert who worked twice at Apple on their most sensitive security projects. He's literally designed FileVault, Apple's disk encryption system. This is a guy who knows how to keep secrets. Here's what Callis revealed. Steve Jobs had discovered an obscure provision in California Vehicle Code Section 4456. The law stated that anyone with a brand new car had up to 6 months, a full 180 days, to affix their issued license plates. During this grace period, you could legally drive with just a temporary paper permit stuck in your windshield. Most people would get their permanent plates mailed to them within 30 days and put them on immediately. But Jobs, he saw an opportunity. Jobs made a deal with his leasing company. Every 6 months, and we're talking almost to the day, he would trade in his current Mercedes SL55 AMG for an absolutely identical one. The same model, the same silver color, the same everything. As Callis puts it, at no time would he ever be in a car as old as 6 months, and thus there was no legal requirement to have number plates fitted. The financial cost. Let's put this into perspective. The Mercedes SL55 AMG wasn't just any car. This was a 510 horsepower supercharged monster that cost around $130,000 brand new, and Jobs was essentially treating these like disposable items. Every 6 months, for years on end, he'd walk away from a nearly new luxury sports car. The depreciation alone would hit about $20,000 or $30,000 per swap. We're talking about Jobs voluntarily losing hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, maybe even over $1 million, just to avoid having license plates. But here's the brilliant part. This was actually beneficial for the leasing company. They had a constant supply of barely used, high-end Mercedes vehicles that had been owned by Steve Jobs himself. Can you imagine the premium they could charge? This SL55 AMG was personally driven by the CEO of Apple. These cars could probably be sold for more than regular used models, except for the John Voight LeBaron. The psychology. So why would someone worth $10 billion go to such elaborate lengths to avoid license plates? Jobs gave different explanations over the years, and they're all revealing. In a 2001 Fortune interview, Jobs claimed it was about avoiding parking tickets. "It's a little game I play," he said casually. But that explanation doesn't really hold water. Having no plates makes you more likely to get pulled over, not less. Later, he told his biographer Walter Isaacson that he didn't want to be followed. But when Isaacson pointed out that the car with missing license plates is actually more conspicuous, Jobs just shrugged his shoulders. As Isaacson recalled, Jobs seemed to think certain rules simply didn't apply to him. But there might have been a deeper reason. Jobs was obsessed with control and privacy. This was a man who later spent $100 million on a yacht and positioned his teenage kid's cabin at the front and his personal cabin at the back just so he could have complete silence and solitude. License plates are fundamentally a government tracking system. Every plate is tied to a specific person at a specific address. For someone as paranoid about privacy as Jobs, the idea of driving around with a government tracking number bolted to his car probably felt deeply offensive. The handicapped parking controversy. But the missing license plates weren't the only controversial thing about Jobs' driving habits. He had another quirk that infuriated people. He consistently parked in handicapped spaces at Apple headquarters. Multiple employees and visitors documented this over the years. Photos from 2006, 2008, and other years show Jobs' plateless Mercedes sitting in handicapped spots. Sometimes he'd even straddle two spaces, as if to make his disregard for the rules even more obvious. This drove Apple employees so crazy, they started leaving passive-aggressive notes. One employee famously left a note on Jobs' windshield that said, "Park different," a play on Apple's Think Different slogan. Apple employees actually started covering handicapped signs and replacing them with "Park Different" stickers. In one spot, someone painted over the wheelchair symbol and replaced it with a giant Mercedes three-pointed star. Now, Jobs was diagnosed with cancer in 2003 and later underwent a liver transplant. But according to Apple employees, his car was never seen with a handicap placard, making his parking technically illegal. This wasn't about medical accommodation. This was about someone who felt rules didn't apply to him. As legendary Apple programmer Andy Hertzfeld put it, Steve seemed to think that the blue wheelchair symbol meant that the spot was reserved for the chairman. The technical details. Let's dig into the actual legal mechanics because they're fascinating. California Vehicle Code Section 4456 was designed to give dealerships and buyers reasonable time to handle paperwork. When you bought a new car, the dealership would submit the paperwork to the DMV, which would then process it and mail you permanent plates. This could take 4 to 6 weeks. During this processing time, you display a temporary paper permit in your front windshield. The law gave you up to 6 months ostensibly to account for DMV delays, paperwork issues, or other complications. What the lawmakers never anticipated was someone systematically exploiting this grace period. Jobs would lease a car, drive it for almost exactly 6 months, then return it one day before the grace period expired and immediately lease an identical replacement. Rinse and repeat. The beauty of this system was that Jobs was always technically in compliance. He always had a valid temporary permit. He never kept a car past the legal deadline. From a technical standpoint, he was following the letter of the law even if it was completely ignoring its spirit. The broader implications. This loophole had consequences beyond just one rich guy's quirky driving habits. By the 2000s, enough people had caught on to the Steve Jobs trick that it was causing real problems for California. Law enforcement couldn't easily identify vehicles without plates. Parking violations went unpaid because there was no way to track down the owners. Hit-and-run accidents became harder to solve. The state estimated it was losing around $19 million per year in bridge tolls and parking fees from unidentifiable vehicles. But the final straw came in 2013 with a tragedy. A man named Michael Bononomi was killed in a hit-and-run by a car with temporary dealer plates. The driver was never identified or caught. The death motivated Assemblyman Kevin Mullen to draft Assembly Bill 516, which would close the loophole permanently. The end of an era. California's government finally had enough. In 2011, they cut their grace period from 6 months to just 3 months, but that wasn't enough to stop dedicated loophole exploiters. So in 2016, Governor Jerry Brown signed AB 516 into law, completely eliminating the grace period. Starting January 1st, 2019, every vehicle sold or leased in California must display a temporary license plate immediately. No more grace period, no more loophole. The law has an informal nickname among legislators and legal experts, the Steve Jobs Law. They literally rewrote California Vehicle Code because of one man's elaborate scheme to avoid license plates. Today, California joins 35 other states that require immediate temporary plates. The Steve Jobs loophole is officially dead. The legacy perspective. Looking back, this story reveals something fundamental about Steve Jobs' character. He was a man worth billions who spent massive amounts of money in effort to circumvent a simple administrative requirement that everyone else just accepted. It shows his obsession with control, his disregard for conventional rules, and his willingness to find creative solutions to problems others didn't even see as problems. These same traits that made him revolutionize computing and smartphones also drove him to spend a fortune avoiding license plates. But it also shows something about wealth and privilege in America. Jobs could afford to burn through luxury cars every 6 months. He could afford to pay parking tickets. He could afford to have a full-time lawyer figure out legal loopholes. Most people can't. The fact that this loophole existed for decades and was primarily exploited by wealthy car enthusiasts highlights how complex legal systems can be gamed by people with enough resources and motivation. The final irony. Here's the ultimate irony. Jobs spent decades and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to stay anonymous and avoid being tracked. But the scheme to avoid license plates made him more recognizable, not less. A silver Mercedes SL 55 AMG with no license plates, parked in a handicapped spot, became Steve Jobs' automotive signature. Tech journalists, Apple employees, and Silicon Valley car enthusiasts could spot him instantly. His attempt at anonymity became the most conspicuous thing about him. As one Apple employee joked, you couldn't miss Steve Jobs' car if you tried. It was the only $130,000 Mercedes in Silicon Valley without plates, always parked where it shouldn't be. In trying to avoid being tracked by the government, Steve Jobs created his own tracking system, one that was far more visible and memorable than any license plate could have been. Closing. The Steve Jobs license plate loophole reveals everything we need to know about the man himself. Brilliant, obsessive, rule-breaking, and willing to pay any price for control. He found a way to legally game the system for decades, cost himself a fortune in the process, and ultimately forced an entire state to rewrite its laws. It's the perfect metaphor for Jobs' entire career. Take something everyone accepted as unchangeable and finding a completely different way to do it. Whether that was the computer interfaces, the mobile phones, or something as mundane as license plates, Steve Jobs was always asking, why does it have to be this way? The loophole is gone now. No one will ever be able to pull off this particular trick again. In a way, it died with Jobs himself. One final think different moment that the world will never see again.